Well, hi everybody, welcome to Afterburner. I'm Bill Whittle. A few days ago, I was idly chasing down a story on the web. Apparently, a global warming alarmist named Steve Zwick said that those skeptics who denied the divine revelation should have their houses burned down, since it was only fair, on account of how their skepticism condemns the entire planet to the flames. Okay. Anyway, I tracked the argument back to a site run by a statistician named William Briggs. It's wmbriggs.com, and I cannot recommend it highly enough as a means of peering behind the curtain of lies, damned lies, and statistics. And on the rotating banner of that site, William Briggs had written what I consider to be the greatest sentence ever. And that was this: love of theory is the root of all evil. That's just magnificent. That just rang me like a bell. Love of theory is the root of all evil. That's really it, isn't it? You know, there's something about theory that appeals to intellectuals, something beyond the pragmatic usefulness that theories often provide. That sentence didn't say theory is the root of all evil. It said the love of theory is the root of all evil. And that's why it's the greatest sentence ever written. Now, big elaborate theories are catnip to certain kinds of people, and these, in my experience, are often people who are not so successful out in the practical world. Big elaborate theories are like a train set in the basement of their minds. They go down there every day and they paint the little mustache on the face of the conductor, and they put little signs in the cafe windows next to the train tracks. And the more complex and realistic it becomes, well, the better they like it. And it's this tendency of the intellectual to get away from the mess of reality and live in the tidy basement of theory that's gotten so many hundreds of millions of people killed. Anyway, that's my theory. How about some evidence? At 7:30 a.m. on the morning of July 1st, 1916, 13 British divisions stepped out into no man's land near the River Somme in France. It was the most meticulously planned operation in the history of warfare. For months, the best minds in the British Empire planned every conceivable detail of the operation: the length and location of the artillery barrage, the speed of the advancing troops, placement of the reserves, the whole thing, the perfect plan, every contingency covered and accounted for. It was the epitome of theory, the triumph of the intellectual and the theoretical ideal. That morning, the British had suffered 19,240 dead, 35,493 wounded, 2,152 missing, and 585 prisoners, for a total loss of 57,470 individual people, most of them gone in the first 15 minutes. 60,000 men gone in a quarter of an hour because of love of theory. Now, contrast that with the behavior of the U.S. Third Army roughly 30 years later and not too far away. Patton's tactics were so fluid, so improvisational, so reactive to the actual situation on the ground that they simply moved faster than theory could follow. When Eisenhower told Patton to bypass the German town of Trier because it would take 4 divisions to capture it, Patton radioed back, "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. What do you want me to do? Give it back?" That is the antithesis of the love of theory that doomed those 60,000 brave British soldiers a generation before. You know, Marx had a theory, so did Engels, and so did Lenin, and so did Stalin. That theory that people would work as hard for a collective as they would for themselves ended up killing about 50 million people in forced starvations, executions, purges, and labor gulags. Mao had a theory that was more or less the same thing, probably another 50 million or so sacrificed to that same bloodthirsty god. Economist Paul Krugman has a theory that says, essentially, if the government is spending so much money that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office predicts that there will no longer be a U.S. economy by 2027, the solution to this problem is to spend more money. He believes, and Pelosi and Obama and Reid believe, that the reason we've not seen any prosperity from this obviously insane theory is because, as with the apologies for communism, we just didn't do enough of it. It's madness. They don't care. Their emotional need for this theory to be true trumps everything else. So, back to metaphorical arsonist Steve Zwick, who's convinced that your real-world house should be burned down because of his theory. Well, all across the spectrum, including a very recent admission by prominent former alarmist James Lovelock, we discover more and more of these intellectuals amazed, astonished, that their theory, which in this case is their global warming computer model, is not matching the data. And many of them are changing their minds, belatedly, but it's happening. But that's not for true believers like Steve Zwick. I'm convinced that this fanatical devotion to theory is the mark of second and third-rate minds, and second and third-rate souls for that matter. Because for guys like Zwick, if there is a direct conflict between the atmosphere and his computer model, well then obviously the atmosphere must be wrong. My friend Bert Rutan has done a devastating statistical and engineering analysis of the AGW argument. It is in fact just that, it's devastating. Defenders of the theory ask what kind of climate science credentials Bert Rutan has, to which he replies, and so help me, this is the crux of the issue, that he's not a climate scientist. He's using their data. He's analyzing their methods. In other words, the flaws are right there before their eyes, but they're too blind to see it. Things run so smoothly down in the basement where the train set is. So, a final coda. You know, when Albert Einstein had a theory of the relationship between matter and energy, his theory boiled itself down to this: E equals mc squared. Now that equation might have covered 15 blackboards. The fact that it was this simple means he must have been right. That theory of relativity has been tested and proven millions of times to hundreds of decimal places. That theory, and many others, have enormous power and value because they're validated by evidence. But when the evidence not only does not support your theory, but in fact actively contradicts it, but your love of theory refuses to let go because of your own mental rigidity and emotional weakness, well, then it's your own house, your own spiritual and intellectual house, that's really on fire.